Hi, this is Ken Sofkowski for AP Gov Review, and in part two of talking about the mass media, we'll be looking specifically at how it helps to shape the political agenda, as was discussed in part one. So the development of mass politics, really from broadcasting to narrowcasting. In the 1960s, it was very common to get your news on television from one of three stations because there just was not a plethora of stations that you have today. That would either be CBS, NBC, or ABC. Now with the explosion of different television channels, you have what's called narrowcasting, or media programming on cable TV or internet that is focused on one topic and aimed at a particular audience. You can look at, for example, C-SPAN, which broadcasts congressional sessions. It's going to be very specific to the people who watch C-SPAN, maybe not a lot of people, but nevertheless, that is a good example of narrowcasting. If you look at the 24-hour news networks, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, all of which have been accused to lean one way or the other, that is also going to be an example of narrowcasting where people are going to be focused on the 24/7 news cycle. Now, the potential of cable to report on news as it happens and offers a myriad of choices to people is really seen today in the 21st century, as you can tune into a number of channels at any given time. So as a result, there are a number of different stories that are going to be shared, but at the same time, you do have resources being limited. In some stories are not substantive, or some stories are just not covered at all, because remember, the media does assume the role of the goalkeeper or the gatekeeper, allowing some stories in and others, not just for the sake of time, sometimes to people who are a little bit cynical in the media. That's because they have a vested interest or some type of bias, but again, that's more for the cynics. Continuing on, the impact of the internet cannot be understated. You have an actual phenomenon. This won't necessarily be covered on the AP Gov exam, but it is helpful in terms of just background content. You have a lot of cable cutting, that people are moving away from television and really going on to the internet. And this is really helping Americans to become more informed about politics. Think about the various avenues that people can get informed with politics. Probably number one is through social media with Facebook, YouTube. That is very important. Now, people on the internet do have a variety and many more choices to choose from as opposed to television. Whereas television does have a high number of choices, the internet has a lot more, and people are choosing what to learn about. But remember, this is somewhat of an issue because, if you have Americans going to sites that they like, but what happens if they're not entirely accurate? So that's become problematic, especially if you have bias. But now it's the people choosing what they want to learn about and what they want to listen to. Since Americans are generally disinterested in politics, as we've discussed in Unit 2 with political behavior, they will not necessarily use the internet for political information. Some do, of course, some don't. But blogs have also become something recently of a phenomenon in which people are getting their information from there as well. Now, over time, there has been a private control of the media in terms of chains. Just to give you an example, mass media conglomerates that amount for over 4/5 of the nation's daily newspaper circulations. That is an incredible amount. So you certainly have a lot of concentration in ownership. For example, with News Corp owning not only Fox News, but also a variety of newspapers. So again, that has increased with private control of the media. Now, this is interesting because this is very specific to the United States, that you have private control. In many European countries, you actually have more public control. They are publicly owned television stations, yet in the United States, it tends to be more private. Now, in terms of reporting the news, and specifically finding the news, oftentimes reporters will have beats. These are specific locations, so if you watch a specific news channel, they might have a congressional correspondent, and that person's coverage area is going to be just on Congress. Or it might be state politics, that person being positioned at the state house. Or you might have a person following a presidential candidate. That would be a person's beat. Also, in terms of the news, sometimes what happens are what are known as trial balloons, where the politician may not know how the public is going to react, so they purposely leak something to assess the political reaction. And if the reaction is favorable, they will certainly go public with it. If it's not, this is something that they will probably backtrack on. So sometimes they'll just test the media, see in terms of what the public reaction will be. Now, reporters and their sources depend on each other, one for stories as well as the other to get them out. Certainly, if there's a scandal, Watergate is, again, probably the hallmark example of AP Gov. You can relate so much to that, whether it's the distrust of the public in the government or whether that's just being in terms of investigative journalism. So reporters and their sources certainly working very close with one another. Now, in terms of presenting the news, really superficial describes most news coverage today. You don't have a lot of in-depth stories. If you watch CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, typically news stories are not that long, especially when you get into the three major network news stations. So, for example, what will often be relied upon are sound bites, these short clips, sometimes under 10 seconds. And if you look from 1968 all the way up to 2004, the soundbite has gotten increasingly smaller. So what used to be 43.1 seconds, that'd be a long soundbite, down to a mere 7.8 seconds in 2004. That tends to be the average amount. Can you really get a substantive amount of information from a candidate that the media, acting again as the controller of what the soundbite is going to play, can you get all that information in 7.8 seconds? And that is certainly indicative of the superficial coverage that can happen. And TV networks are devoting less time to covering political candidates, and that has been seen over time. Now, in terms of bias in the news, many people believe news is biased. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, three of the major 24/7 hour news networks have been repeatedly accused of bias, favoring one ideological view over another. Now, generally speaking, this is not the case toward that a news station would favor a particular ideology. Again, that's the official sort of AP Gov stance, but nevertheless, there are some instances in which you might be able to make a case for that, but I digress nevertheless. Now, news reporting is biased towards what will draw the largest audience, right? Good pictures and negative reporting, scandals, anything of that nature is going to be let into the news. So really, you have an inherent bias in what is shown and what is not, even without tainting how something is worded or how something is shown. Just by letting something be covered and letting something not be covered, you inherently do have bias. But the media and political campaigns, certainly you have advertising with negative attack ads. We've all seen them before. That's very much hallmark of the media. News coverage, media offers a free opportunity to spread the message. For example, Donald Trump spent very little during the primary on his own campaign. Why? He was getting free media coverage. And that is great, affords a great opportunity for the candidate to get out his or her message. And when you do have controversial stories, you typically will have somebody from your campaign, known as informally the spin doctor, who tries to influence journalists with interpretations of events that are going to be favorable to the candidate, especially when there is a negative story being portrayed against that candidate. Now, the media will also try to hold candidates accountable for some of their claims. Websites such as factchecker.org and politicalfact.com will evaluate the candidate's claims. Also, the media will certainly do that, and they'll try to challenge that candidate later on. And also with media involved in political campaigns, they host debates. And you saw this certainly in the primaries. You see this during the election season. And it gives the public an opportunity to see both candidates together debating substantive issues as opposed to the horse race journalism in which you're following the candidate every day, as we saw in the political party unit. Certainly the White House press corps, this is a full-time journalist covering the activities of the president on a daily basis, and comprises of not just television, but also print journalists as well. And then you also have the press secretary, who is responsible for handling the press corps for the President of the United States. All right, so the news and public opinion, as we said, the most important thing that news can do is the agenda-setting effect as to what things people are going to see as the most important. So again, television does have a major role here. Media influence is the criteria by which the public evaluates political leaders. So if, let's say, gun rights in the gun debate is going to be most important towards the media, that will certainly be in the same frame of mind for many of the people viewing television. And of course, some events, stories are going to be more important, others less important depending on the amount of coverage. But again, the policy agenda, which is set heavily to some extent by the media, is going to attract serious attention towards public officials and other people actively involved in politics at that time. And then we have what are called policy entrepreneurs. These are people who invest their political capital in an issue to get it placed high on the governmental agenda. This could be what we call the political elite. For example, Michael Moore is very famous for his documentaries and raising issues that he deems important, such as universal health care. So you could call him a policy entrepreneur. But again, they're using the media to raise awareness of the issue. Now, again, to reiterate, one of the major functions of the media, they do serve as a watchdog, restricting politicians, unearthing scandals that may go on. Also, proposals by governmental officials certainly are going to be evaluated and scrutinized heavily. The media certainly identifies a problem. It's going to force the government to address it because, remember, they do have that very all-important agenda-setting effect. All right, and lastly, individualism and the media candidates are going to run their own campaign by appealing to the people through television. Again, that seems to be certainly the dominant norm, although the internet is rising quite quickly in terms of the number of people who use it for their source of information. But it is easier to focus on one person like the president than groups for the media, so that's why you see the president as the most heavily covered person or government official in the United States. Congress gets less attention, especially courts, and then when you look at state and local elections, you see even less attention unless there's some type of major scandal or news story there. But it is important to note that really the media is furthering democracy in many ways. Information is the fuel of democracy, right? It is providing information to voters who are going to make these important choices during November elections based on what they hear and based on what they read. But news provides more entertainment today than information. Certainly, it is much more superficial as to what you may have seen back in the 1960s and 1970s, where you really had better journalism going on. But now with entertainment sort of factoring in a little bit more, you don't really see that hardcore journalism as much anymore. And remember, at the end of the day, news is a business and giving the viewers or the people what they want to hear or see. So in summary, media shapes public opinion. Again, it has that agenda-setting effect. Broadcast media has certainly replaced print media over time. You're going to see also the internet coming in and probably overtaking television in not the near future, but certainly a few decades to come. Narrowcasting and the internet are further shifting the media, right, where you can focus on a specific audience and a specific topic. And TV is still, of course, the main source of information, but falling amongst especially young people who are engaging in what is known as cord cutting. And then seeking profits media are biased in favor of stories with high drama. That is certainly important. News agencies are businesses at the end of the day. All right, take a look at this review question for a moment. Pause it on your screen to read it, and then we'll go over it. All right, so which of the following statements about sound bites is accurate? And if you said choice D, you are correct. The media's tendency to focus on sound bites allows politicians to avoid an in-depth discussion of issues. It allows it just to remain superficial, unfortunately.